Great. Well, first of all, I want to welcome everyone. I think we have a really exciting and very thorough time plan today. I think this is really exciting. Before I introduce our two hosts, first of all, I want to say it's no secret that mainframes are cumbersome, antiquated, expensive. They don't interface with modern technology, and there's a lot of strategies to really look at the art of the possible on what can be done with them. So joining today as our hosts, I'd like to first start by introducing Ted Pappas. Ted is the president of ReluTech. Over the past 20 years, Ted's helped over 1,000 companies consolidate and migrate from data centers and really free themselves from the vendor lock OEMs put on organizations. Ted spends his day working with senior leaders to monetize hardware infrastructure, decommission data centers, and their reliance on expensive, antiquated technology, and really harness the power of the public cloud. So, Ted, we're really thrilled to have you. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, Joseph, as always, awesome to see you, Aaron. We do this a lot together, so this is going to feel natural for us. But I'd like to just echo what you said is the art of the possible as it relates to the public cloud. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in the public cloud, and there's a lot of really cool stuff going on in the data center. The data center seems to be the forgotten land, and ReluTech and our company, we've spent decades helping customers develop asset lifecycle management strategies and way to exit the data center and then repurpose those funds to public cloud adoption. So I'm looking forward to the next hour or half hour here. So thank you again.
Great, Ted. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce your co-host, Aaron Bawcom. Aaron is widely recognized as one of the leading global experts on cloud transformation. Aaron holds 11 different certifications on cloud across all three cloud platforms. He's an AWS Global Ambassador and somebody that spends his days really working with senior executives to help them kind of harness the power of the cloud and transform their operations. So Aaron, anything you'd like to add as well?
Thanks, Joseph. We'll see if I can live up to all that. But, yeah, I have an incredibly fun job. Like I get to work with CIOs, CTOs, senior executives for Fortune 500 firms that the conversations usually start with a stare of how do I move a mainframe that's at the center of my entire business and has been so for the last 30 years, It's unthinkable to consider, how do you migrate and move that from a technology perspective, because it's sprawling, it's everywhere, it's an ecosystem in and of itself, and it's so legacy. So I have the fortunate opportunity to work with some of the most amazing technologically advanced clients in the world that run businesses that run our global economy, and figuring out how to be able to move these workloads out of the mainframe into the cloud. And the good news is it's definitely possible. It's been done, and it continues to be to happen at a faster and faster rate. So looking forward to the conversation today to kind of start drilling into what that means.
Great. I also want to invite everyone on the call. We would love your questions. So please jump in whenever you'd like with questions, but I kind of wanted to start us out with the first question that I'm sure is on a lot of your minds out there, which is really, how do you start thinking of a long-term mainframe strategy? And Aaron, I guess I want to start with you. I know you and your team were the first company in the world to successfully and securely migrate a mainframe to the public cloud, which you did for a Fortune 100 enterprise. So how do you start thinking of that long-term mainframe strategy?
So the good news is that moving a mainframe just turns into a really large IT program, right? Where most CIOs and CTOs are used to being able to structure large IT programs to be able to accomplish some pretty significant large initiatives for their organization. So being the first to do it, that's exactly what it was for us. It's definitely not a one vendor thing, right? It takes a village. You know, the one that we have documented that we did with AWS is documented in detail. It's out on AWS website. And I think there was 4 professional service vendors and 8 different ISVs involved over the entire process. So it's very significant, but it's just proof of concept, you know, figure out, you know, what kind of things can migrate, you know, getting the inventory, and then also being ready for the surprises, for the ahas, for the unknowns, because we all know that they're there. So basically planning for that effectively, having a right test strategy, the right engagement with the business, and all the technology components is a really key big part. And I'm also really curious, you know, about Ted from his experience, because I know he's done this a lot, you know, as far as how to pull this off from a strategy perspective.
Yeah, and Ted, before you answer that, one of the things that you'd mentioned is you talked about separating the financial piece, which is really the business case, from the technical piece. You know, would love to hear about your expertise there as well.
No, I appreciate it, and Aaron hit the nail on the head here. My answer is going to be significantly different than what Aaron's is. In terms of size and scale, I would say they're virtually identical. There aren't many mid-market companies in down that have mainframe. So like Aaron and Candid partners, our focus is in the enterprise space too. It's a global pursuit. And to Aaron's point, these big pieces of iron have been on data center floors, presumably for decades in some cases. The staff has been there literally for decades. Some of them, it's their only job. But for us, the technology is really the easy part. For Aaron, it's way different, way more sophisticated, very different. For us, the technology is the easy part. And the long pole in the tent for where we spend our time with our customers is looking at how to eliminate some of that capital debt off of the ledger as it relates to the mainframe. So there's hardware considerations, there's software considerations, there's licenses considerations, and at the end of the day, you know, IBM is the real player in the market. They have a monopoly. They've got a great go-to-market around locking their customers into that monopoly and decomposing the financial transactions and the financial contracts and the software and the licenses from the mainframe, driving some of that cost out, finding ways that you can separate some of those services to third-party providers and begin to break the lock of OEM is where we spend our time. So we talk finances to CIOs and finances to CFOs significantly more than we talk technology to those folks.
Yeah, in fact, that kind of leads me to my next question, which is what does that separation look like? Ted?
Separation from the vendor. Separation from the vendor is simple. Wait a minute. Conceptually, the start of separation from the vendor is simple. And the start of it is, how do you avoid a refresh? OEMs are in the business of selling new hardware. The economic strategies of their go-to-markets around their mainframes and services are focused on you buying new hardware. It's not you keeping that legacy hardware on the data center floor. So we look at ways to alternate finance for customers who are committed to moving workloads to AWS or a public cloud environment where we can structure capital or operating leases to offset some of that debt on the balance sheet. It garners a ton of interest. Everybody is interested in saying, will you buy the mainframe? Will you lease it back? Will you support it until it goes? And the answer is yes. Does it offer considerable financial relief? The answer is yes. But really where the rubber meets the road is in the support of those mainframes. So the separation of the OEM and the start of how you begin to avoid a refresh was with a customer is to take services off their plate. And hardware break fix support contracts is the number one thing. OEMs, as I said, are in the business of selling new hardware. They sell new hardware that typically depreciates over 5 years, but they put 3-year support contracts on those machines. So at the end of 3 years, you've got two options. You can pay for expensive extended support contracts to the OEMs, or you can buy a new piece of hardware with 3 years built in. And we found a way through decades of experience, as you said, through thousands of customers around the planet, to separate the hardware support contracts from the software and from the licenses. And if you offshoot or outsource that support contract to third-party companies, you literally can drive millions and millions of dollars out of that line item on the P&L. So financial separation for us is the releasing of capital debt and breaking support contracts.
Great. Aaron?
Yeah, exactly. Just to kind of foot stomp exactly what Ted's saying is, how do you separate? You got to start looking in the mirror first, and separating the financials from the technology. You won't make it out of the gate. You will stay on the block if this is solely a technology-based decision within your organization, right? Separating the financial aspects from the technology aspects is really, really important. I remember a conversation I had with the head of technology for a large top 20 bank who said, I'd rather sell the entire bank than migrate the mainframe, because the technology challenge seems so difficult. But from a financial perspective, the CFO is going to have a very different view of that. So, being able to separate out the software licensing, the purchasing power, I liken it back to a large hotel chain that had partnered with IBM for a number of years. And he said, we really want to get out of the mainframe. We want to not use this IBM technology, anymore. And what ended up happening is a large, purchasing power challenge, right? Because the mainframe vendor used that hotel chain to actually house people within hotels. And so there was this leverage aspect that was really difficult to overcome. So being able to separate out those is really, really important. When it comes to, the technology aspects, and separating, the skill differences are also very, very difficult. The last time I checked, COBOL hasn't been taught in colleges for about 20 years. So, it's not like you can just go out on the street and hire a mainframe developer to come in and be able to do that. So being able to start modernizing those skill sets is really important, to being able to, again, separate from the vendor, separate from the technology is what separation really starts to look like.
You guys talked about COBOL and assembler not being taught in schools. How are companies finding these resources today, and what's happening to those resources?
Aaron, me or you?
Ted, you go ahead.
All right, because my suspicion is we're going to have very different answers again. So for us, financial separation is on the hardware side. And Aaron, I've heard Aaron say that before. I think it's my favorite phrase that he says, COBOL hasn't been taught in 20 years. Well, neither has replacing a punch card. And in 1988 or 89, when I started my career at Delta Airlines as a mainframe guy, we were punch carding it, and people just don't teach that now. And really the sad thing is there's a lot of really, really good talent on the market. IBM does a great job at hiring those, but there are other avenues. For instance, our founder and CEO, a guy named Mark Matz, just started a company called Nerd Rabbit. I'd encourage every one of you to look it up, nerdrabbit.com. And it really is designed to be a vehicle to house those that are looking for just gig economy work. So people that are semi-retired, they are retired. There's a platform for those people away from IBM. The second thing is we hire and train, and we're certainly not hiring junior folks and training on COBOL, but when people leave corporate world like IBM, we hire them and we train them and we teach them cloud migrations, and then we offer that as an extension to our customers as either an a la carte service or an hourly. So I'd say platforms like NerdRabbit for gig economists, or I'd say look at talent in a hardware break fix maintenance provider for a la carte services.
Aaron, your thoughts?
Yeah, usually when we start working with the client, they've got a lot of talent internally that has been trained up and has been a part of the mainframe process for a number of years. Those key individuals that have that kind of tribal knowledge of the ecosystem of the mainframe. So when it comes to, hey, we're going to migrate off the mainframe into the public cloud, it's going to take a X amount of time to be able to do so. The reception falls into three different categories. So the first one is some people are already on the edge and they hear that and they just say, I'm out, just see ya, I remember one lady that we worked with at a migration. She was in her 70s and she was the only person who knew how to give anybody access to the mainframe. That was her only job. And she had grandkids and she really wanted to spend time with her grandkids. She became our biggest cheerleader. She's like, close this down, turn it off so I can spend all my time with my grandkids, right? So there's that set that they want to instantly retire as fast as possible, right? There's a set of resources that they're saying, okay, I don't really want to retrain or recertify, so I'm just gonna do my time and just, by the time we get there, by the time we're done with the migration, I'll be ready to retire, and I'll just kind of keep going, working on it until the last little bit's out, and then I'll just exit. And then there's a set of people who really want to retrain and recertify. And these are some of the most exciting conversations that I have. I liken it back to a gentleman who had spent 30 years responsible for over 200 million lines of COBOL for a top 5 bank. And I remember my first conversation with him about, hey, you got to move all this out to the cloud. What do you feel about that? And he was like, I'm excited. I can't wait. He's like, I have been with this thing for a long time, and I am ready for that to be the previous book, and I want to start on my next book, right? And start a whole new story of my technical life and my expertise and capabilities in the cloud. So that's kind of the three different categories for resources, and usually where they fall on the spectrum when it comes to the skill sets that are available.
Great. First of all, thank you guys. I know there are good and bad mainframe strategies. So I guess, Aaron, I'll start with you. What is an example of a bad mainframe strategy?
A bad mainframe strategy is like, again, I liken it back to a large IT project. So let's say that you're a CFO. And so if you're a CFO watching this, right, if your CIO comes to you and says, here, I'd like to spend $700 million over the course of the next 8 years to completely rewrite and re-architect our system in the cloud, and you won't see any benefit at all. And at least 2 years in, you should pause, right? Because there have been several projects throughout history where that has been the model, right? Is let's go re-architect and rewrite every single thing on the mainframe into microservices, put them into Docker containers or something else that run the cloud, and they have massive risk, a huge amount of technical challenge that go with it, and the payoff is just really, really slow. So that is what we've seen in the market across the industry over and over again as a very dangerous mainframe migration strategy.
Ted?
Yeah, along the lines of what Aaron was saying, a bad mainframe strategy for us would be believing that IBM is the single source of truth. We work with a large bank. I know Aaron just talked about banks that has a couple of mainframes in a lower environment. In particular, their Z13s, which IBM has just put is end of life. The IBM Z13 is bulletproof. It will run a very, very long time. IBM conveniently puts it as end of life. They put some configuration information into IBM to buy a new, really beefy Z15 at 7 or 8 figures all in. They were introduced to our program, and they tried to back out of the deal, and IBM just says no. So to Aaron's point, not looking at transformation before and I think Aaron said 700 million. That's a pretty big number for us, but not looking at transformation opportunities before the 8-figure number comes from the single source of truth is a way to get into what we call the refresh cycle of death. And capital debt governs the way that you run your business. And for IT, it's just not a healthy position to be in.
Well, I guess as we look at the other end of the spectrum then, maybe starting with you, Ted, what's an example, conversely, of a great mainframe strategy?
Start with the bad and end with the good, right? So a great mainframe strategy would be a 5th or 6th largest global bank on the planet that has multiple mainframes in production and multiple mainframes in the lower environments for disaster recovery. That financial institution is working with AWS for public cloud adoption, and they're letting the financial components, as we talked about before, drive that decision for the IT folks. So really exploring ways to not just compete against IBM, but work with IBM. Separating hardware break-fix support from IBM is a very, very reasonable, scalable, and low-risk move. But on the other side of the coin, separating software support and looking at decoupling licensing agreements with IBM, outsourcing that is a terrible idea. So partnering with a financial executive at a big bank that I just described to work with IBM on what components of the mainframe can be outsourced to drive some cost out while remaining OS and licenses, while people like Aaron do all the refactoring and rewriting. So indirectly driving cost out of hardware, repurposing that transformation and working potentially with IBM and doing it. Let finances be the guiding light for transformation is how I'd answer that question.
Great. And I'd also like to get Aaron's take. Aaron, I know you and your team drive that transformation in mainframe strategy. I know there's a lot of different options that you and your team have come up with, and it really depends on the client. But maybe you could take us through your kind of your talk track of what a great mainframe strategy looks. And I think you have a slide as well that might outline different options as well.
Yeah, so that's the technology aspect as far as the approach, right? The technical approach, but I want to completely, again, foot stomp exactly what Ted said, is that it's really important that it be a financial, capability, right? A financial perspective as far as, the good mainframe migration strategy. Because I can say I want to migrate the mainframe, and there's, a million different technical ways to be able to do it, but saying what is the one where I can gain the most amount of value the fastest, right? How can I realize some kind of financial gain as fast as possible is really, really important. I cite a client, a major financial services client that moves around trillions of dollars a day, where this is exactly the approach that we took with them, where we came in and they've got a huge mainframe, a lot of stuff on there, but hey, let's take this one thing that's pretty critical. It's not the most critical, but it's up there in the top 10% of critical applications. Let's push that out to the cloud. Hey, and let's show that we got a 90% gain out of that within a fairly short time frame. right? So what that does is provide that lighthouse, right? That in the middle of the sea of unknowns and uncertainties of technology and finances, if I can point to, hey, we did this and we did it very effectively and we lowered cost a huge amount, that starts to act as that lighthouse for all the other perspectives that are invariably going to be a part of it. As far as the great mainframe migration strategy from a technical perspective, it's hybrid in nature. So I talked earlier about a bad one just says, hey, let's just go re-architect everything into microservices. So that's bad. So the good is let's have a hybrid approach. Okay. So for this one application that's massive, online transaction processing that has very low latency, we're going to manually rewrite that one. Then for these 10 applications, or let's say these 50 applications, we're going to automate the refactoring of those. There's some really fantastic whiz-bang technology tools to be able to do that. It's a technical term, right? It's whiz-bang. And then as soon as you're able to automate that code, converting from COBOL into Java, for these remaining 150 applications that are batch-oriented, data set triggered, use a lot of vSAN, use the hierarchical database like IMS or things like that. It's a huge, probably a large amount of the code base. We're going to use middleware emulation for that. So these are all these technical terms that I'm talking about, but the summary here is use a hybrid approach. Don't use one technical approach for every application type as far as how you migrate it. Look at the technology and choose the right technical approach for each one of them. And using people who understand these types of tools and who have kind of done this before is really important, as opposed to just listening to one tool vendor, because most tool vendors are going to say, my tool is the only tool you need, right? And as a client, you should be aware of that, right? You should be wary of it. So that's what a good mainframe technical migration strategy looks like, is one that's hybrid in nature.
I'd also like to open up the floor as well to questions from some of our audience.
I see one of the questions is about COBOL. So, when I had said that, hey, it's not being taught, I meant like in general. I'm quite sure that there is still COBOL being taught somewhere out there. I just remember when I was in school a long time ago, it was required. Everybody had to have it. Whereas today, it's, if you want to know that, you can take a course, that goes through it. It was really just the intent is that the availability of resources who understand COBOL across the broad industry is not nearly what it was 20 years ago. That was really the intent.
Andy Yother has raised hand, I think may have a question. Andy? I don't know if we can. Maybe we can type it in. Okay.
Yeah, Tim. What do you, and here he typed it, what do you find to be the most challenging entry point to a migration? Great question. Ted, why don't you take that?
Yeah, Andy, if I hope you're not expecting a terribly complex answer here, because it's not. It's fairly simple, and the most challenging entry point to a migration is the technical debt from the mainframe on the ledger. It's really difficult to move production-based enterprise class workloads to any public cloud. It's very expensive, and it's really hard and really expensive when you have the duplicative cost of that mainframe on the books. So if a services agreement is going to be X in terms of cost, you may be sitting on capital debt structures of $3 to $4 to $5 million, which is why I talked about looking at this as a finance decision and finding a way to separate some of those costs and potentially services away and repurpose that to writing down some of that debt is, from my view from the lens, the absolute number one most challenging thing of a question. But great question.
Yeah.
Aaron, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, the way I see it is I like, the way Ted puts it, it's debt, right? And we're all used to debt existing on a balance sheet. Technical debt has taken on kind of, a life of its own within corporate IT for the last 20 or 30 years. So let's say you've got you're in a relationship, like, corporations in a relationship with their mainframe or their mainframe vendor. And let's say your spouse, kind of stacks up 20 different credit cards with a ton of debt on these credit cards, right? Having the conversation of, hey, we need to talk about all these credit cards you've got and all this debt, right? Having that initial conversation that we have a problem, right? We have a very serious problem where we have stacked up debt on top of debt on top of debt, and we have to start digging out of the debt that we are in, right? And really start being able to address it. So when it comes to entry point, it's establishing a flag in the ground, right? And saying, we're going to be off the mainframe by X. And it doesn't really matter how long it is. You could say it's 20 years, right? You could say it's, whatever time frame. Just getting the conversation started with, okay, we're going to be off the mainframe at some point. So let's start talking about what it looks like, right? And getting that conversation going is really, really important within the organization. There's so many conversations that I've had that have started with, people can't even consider it. It's so far out of their mindset from a technical and from a financial perspective to start dealing with.
There's another question that just came in. How do you address hardware support with software support and licenses?
As I mentioned before, in the x86 world, separating hardware support means that software support and licenses, for the most part, remain in quarantine, which might not be a great word to use right now in the middle of our global pandemic, but it remains in quarantine in perpetuity, which means forever. x86 world, once hardware support goes out, the OEMs absolutely will not get near the machine. IBM is the opposite. As I mentioned before, they really are a monopoly, and they know it. So if you've got a really mature financial sponsor in a company, IBM will work with you, and they'll work with the end user and other parties associated with transformation to allow you to support the machine, the hardware support on the machine, independent from software and OS. And in some cases, not all, but some cases on the mainframe, the box is not locked out in perpetuity. There are firmware and security patches available via T&M through IBM. So where they are a monopoly and they will try to lock end users into keeping the mainframe on the floor forever, they know it. And they're getting a lot more partner friendly in allowing companies to support hardware while not being too disruptive to software and licenses. Very different from x86, but that's a very good question.
Yeah, and from our experience on the software side, you could see a large, set of mainframes, with a lot of software systems, whether they're proprietary or custom or whatever they are. The first stage is just mapping that software to x86, and you think, wow, that's incredible. But literally, I think back to a large mainframe migration we did where, yeah, it was 50 different software tools. So it was an Excel spreadsheet that had 50 rows, right? And every row was this piece of software. Okay, here's how we're going to solve for that on x86. I mean, it's like any other technology problem. You're going to go through each piece of software. How are we going to solve for that one? How are we going to solve for that one? The good news is 95% of the software that runs on mainframe today has an x86 equivalent. You just have to find it, identify it, put the migration plan in place for it. The other pieces, you may have to switch to a slightly different version or, slightly different technology or code something to be able to solve for it, but it's definitely possible. The other problem with software is that when you switch from that mainframe software license to the x86 software license, software licensing can be a challenge as well, right? Because some of the software vendors aren't necessarily tuned for cloud, right? And how you can operate on the cloud. So I think back to one mainframe migration where we were doing the business case, and what we found is that if we just accepted the software licensing from the vendor, we were going to be running on boxes that had 32 cores on the virtual machine. And the vendor wanted to charge $150,000 per core, right? And so if you do 150,000 times 32 cores, it blew out our entire business case. There was no way it was going to make financial sense. Exactly to the point. It's got to make financial sense to do it. So what did we do? We worked with that software vendor and said, hey, we're only going to use 2 cores. We don't need to license all 32 cores. So we just need what's called sub-capacity licensing, right? Work with the vendor to do that. We licensed it for 2 cores, brought that cost down by 90%, made the business case work. Migration went through, had a huge 65% cost reduction in the first year, right? Show up on the balance sheet. So, those are kind of some of the lessons learned on the software side.
Hey, Aaron, that dovetails really well with my next question. I know you and your team have migrated not only the first in the world, but you've migrated mainframes for very large enterprises. And I think people really want to know, without giving away anything proprietary, but what kind of cost saving can an enterprise anticipate from migrating the mainframe?
That's a fantastic question. So what we have found is that x86 to x86 on-prem to x86 in the cloud, is usually like a 30% cost reduction, right? Just right there, that kind of, cost reduction. When we go to AIX, it's usually around a 50% cost reduction. You go to mainframe, you start to get to 65% cost reduction. And that's not re-architecting, refactoring, or any of that. It's just re-platforming into the cloud. So we've seen cost savings on kind of the worst case side of 65%, up to the best case where you're actually re-architecting at 95% reduction in cost from the mainframe by re-architecting in the cloud. So the savings can be rather massive. And there's lots of data points out there from a lot of different tool vendors, and different migrations to be able to prove that point. So there is a huge financial story here. And what it really takes is, the CFO of an organization to really ask hard for that number. Hey, what is my business case to migrate the mainframe? And we'll figure out the technology later. Just getting that business case established allows for the entire conversation to get started.
Ted, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was dying to jump in. We could ask that question a lot too. I don't know if somebody asked that in the chat bot. I can't see it, but the question's great.
It was actually mine, so thank you.
Yeah, it's a good one because some of it, to Aaron's point, there's so much data that goes into it. It's really, really hard to quantify. Big mainframe manufacturers, I've said the name a bunch, do a really good job at hardware and software and licensing and services bundled into one gigantic 8 or 9 figure annual contract for enterprise customers. Now, one thing I can tell you with 100% certainty is by separating those services out on the hardware side, it is never, Joseph, this is a big statement. It's never more expensive, like ever, never more expensive We see savings. We've got a customer, a retailer who unfortunately has been going through bankruptcy. They've got a big Z12 or Z13, some old machine that's going to be retired by virtue of public cloud adoption. They were on a month-to-month support contract with IBM, and they were paying them like $125,000 a month for a company that's going through bankruptcy. In that use case, we're able to drive out 90% of that cost over the course of 8 months. It funds a migration. So I'm like Aaron. I don't know that I would say that, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% is the norm. It's 100% of the time, never more expensive, and almost always greater than 50%. But I love the question.
Great. Another question for both of you, maybe Ted, maybe we'll start with you on this one. Mainframes do not break often, but when they do, what do you do?
That's a good question too. I wish I could see the names of the people that were on here. They don't break very often. They're bulletproof. It's why they have been on floors for decades, and it's why the people that's supporting them, to Aaron's point before, Aaron, I never heard that story, was a 72-year-old grandmother who wanted to retire and nobody could fix it. But what you can fact check is the data behind what fails and how often it fails. So simple things, looking at failure logs, pulling VPD files. It's really easy for mainframe support folks to decompose what parts are at risk and what parts need the most redundancy. And then there's an enormously large secondary hardware market for mainframe parts. And the idea behind what we do is to decompose the most commonly failed drives, as I mentioned, look at the most redundant parts, go to the secondary market, build parts kits, ship those part kits to the customer site, and park them there, whether it's in a locker or in a cage on the data center floor. And when we have a failure, it's very easy to diagnose what it is, the parts on site, and dispatch a techs to go fix it. So our failures, do they fail often? No. Are they preventable? No. Are they fairly, is it reasonable to predict what part is going to fail? That you can do. And if you put a logistics strategy in place to predict what part is going to fail, then SLAs can be met. A great question for whoever asked it.
Great. Aaron, anything you'd like to add to that?
Just with everything Ted said is 100% correct. The experience that we have is that once these apps get migrated to the cloud, whether they're re-architected or whether even they're re-platformed, shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Actually run a lot better. We've actually heard support teams who support COBOL start supporting that COBOL in the cloud, right? Running on x86 and say, man, this runs a lot faster. Wow, we have a lot less errors now that we're running on x86 in the cloud than we did even running on mainframe itself. So, we've actually got data that shows that it actually it's far more resilient. There's less errors, less problems, and higher performance running in the cloud. I guess you would usually expect it, but it's just really great having data from real live support teams that, really corroborate that they actually say, thank goodness we migrated this to the cloud. This next question, I love this. The use case that fascinates me for mainframes are huge centralized transaction ledgers that operate in real time. What does that use case look like in public cloud? Great question. So first off, there's just like I said earlier, good mainframe migration strategy is going to be hybrid, right? So it's going to depend. And even that type of application, a high transaction throughput online transaction application can still be designed multiple ways in the cloud. I think back to a major airline that we were working with who they said, well, we require 300,000 IOPS for our top throughput IOPS application for our reservations, right? And we can't get that in the cloud. And that's the reason that at that time, the cloud vendor, I think, supported a maximum of like 120,000 IOPS. 1 week passed, and it just so happened that AWS announced new IOPS capabilities on a virtual machine that supported 1.2 million IOPS. So even replatforming that type of application to the cloud, suddenly possible, right? Just keeping the COBOL, keeping everything the same, because the performance attributes of the cloud, as we all know, 22 billion of R&D going in every year, keep getting better. Just wait 5 minutes and it'll, you'll see these new features that'll come out. That's a replatform. For a re-architecture, so I cite an example that we did for a major payment processor, where we pushed through 1.6 trillion transactions of payment transactions through a completely re-architected solution within 30 hours. So that's 14 million transactions per second, right? That we were able to actually handle. And what we were using was your standard off-the-shelf cloud services like in AWS, Lambda, and DynamoDB, and API Gateway, and Kinesis, right? To be able to have that high transaction throughput application work at very high scale with very low latency and never miss one. If you think about 1.6 trillion payment transactions, you're going to have duplicates sometimes, and you're also going to have potentially some misses. And the way we designed and architected it, we didn't miss a single transaction. So it depends on how you design it and how you architect it, whether you use containers or whether you use serverless based off of certain non-functional requirements. But that's, those are some good examples for how to solve that particular type of problem.
Great. Ted, anything you'd like to add as well?
That's a tough one for me. I mean, that was, I just found out in the chat, so I can see the question here, but they are huge. They do operate in real time, but they're bulletproof. From our perspective, they're bulletproof. When they do fail, there's multiple levels of redundancy. And I'd actually answer, how do you keep them operating in real time? Exactly as I answered the question before. It's a bulletproof logistics strategy with a tight SLA, with qualified resources to show up and fix a failed drive in the event of a disaster of a production-based machine. So again, mine's far less complex than Aaron is. It's drive cost out of the model to support it, build a bulletproof logistical strategy, and be really intentional about what parts are going to fail when.
Let me see if we have any other questions. Maybe as we're waiting for another question, if any of the folks in attendance want to reach out to you or Aaron, I know that ReluTech and Candid are very different organizations. Maybe both of you, either of you, could talk for a second about maybe the difference between the two and how folks, if they would like to reach out to each of you, how your specialty sort of differs.
Aaron, me or you?
You go first.
All right. There is an unbelievably clear line of demarcation between what ReluTech does and what Candid does. I mean, it's simple. And the answer is where the hardware starts, ReluTech starts. Where the hardware ends, Candid is. So we are very different, but we're uniquely positioned for really, I think, two reasons. Reason number one is we have absolutely zero competitiveness between our two companies, and genuine relationships work when they're bi-directional. So if Aaron and I are out to solve the same problem for the customer, which is number two, things work really well. The second thing is the business outcome that we seek for our customers, the destination remains the same, and that is avoid the refresh, get rid of capital debt, and get the workload to a public cloud. So non-competitive companies focus on the same outcome. Aaron, I don't know if you'd add anything, or if you just want to tell how they can get in touch with you and I. Or Joseph, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. Aaron, I'd love to get your take as well. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, exactly as Ted cited, there's a lot of differences between the firms. Our focus at Candid is very, very much on the technology aspect. I love one of the questions I got from one of my clients at one point. who's, said, hey, we've got, this special technology, aspect of how we built the mainframe where sometimes, the mainframe processor can be, not necessarily item potent for instructions, that sometimes instruction can go in and, and get a result. But if I send the exact same instruction again, then I might not get exactly the same result back out. And this is some nuances of actually how mainframe processors work. And that's exactly the type of thing that Candid answers, right? Is how to solve that type of problem, right? Those incredibly nuanced, really, really difficult technical issues that are incredibly deep. How do you convert rack F discretionary access control into a structure that's actually going to work in the cloud, and being able to develop that technology or use something off the shelf to be able to solve that. So, our forte is understanding all the tools that are on the market, the best practices that are being used across all the major migrations that are occurring throughout the industry, and being able to apply the exact right mix for your organization. It's not every recipe is going to work for every company. And so a lot of what we do is, apply just enough sugar and just as much salt and just as much flour to make sure that you get the perfect cake, right, for your mainframe, baking it in the clouds, right? So it's a simple analogy, but it really is what we do is apply our best practices and our experience to these really tough problems to be able to help you through this journey.
Great. And guys, one of the questions that just came in, one of our attendees wants to know, Ted and Aaron, what role do you guys specifically play during these projects? So maybe we'll start with Aaron and then go over to Ted.
So great question. As CTO of the company, I've got a team of cloud architects, cloud developers, DevOps engineers that I work with to make sure we deliver the right cloud solution. So I usually engage up front, make sure that the engagement is the right engagement, that we've got things structured the right way. And then I stay very close in touch with the team that's actually doing the migration or doing the engagement to make sure that any type of problems that come up are dealt with and facilitated. That said, we have an incredible set of technologists that are a lot smarter than me at being able to solve some of these. So I just kind of tend to be on the front side of the conversation, but there's some crazy smart guys behind me that take it over and could probably do a much better job than me.
Ted?
Yeah, I'd answer it similarly to Aaron. I'll give you a little example. We had a big onboarding class one day last summer. We onboarded, I don't know what the number was, 10 to 15 new hires in one day. And we had a Q&A at the end, much like this. And one of the recent college grads, they raised their hand and said, look, as president of the company, what do you do all day? And my answer was, I help our customers solve problems.
Yeah.
So what I do every day and what role I play in the company is 100% focused on helping customers solve problems. I spend a ton of time with our big partner AWS and helping build programs that they can then message to their customers. But just like Aaron said, when we engage a customer, the customer engagement is always led by me. There's some level of executive alignment, whether it's a chief purchasing officer, a CIO, or a CFO. So there's program executive alignment. And then, like Aaron said, I'm a smart guy, but not nearly as smart as the people that are behind us. So, I work really well with our product teams and our data center experts and our logistics teams and the technicians that are supporting this drives inside these big mainframes. Get them engaged, have them drive the outcome, and then just stay engaged with the customer through regular weekly cadences until the project is concluded. But my time is with customers 100%. Not 100%, near 100%.
Okay, great. Guys, it doesn't look like there are any open questions at the moment, and I know we just have a couple of minutes left. So if any folks that are attending now, wait a minute, I think I may have just gotten one question that came in. It says, how do ReluTech and Candid services complement each other?
Aaron, can I go?
Yeah, absolutely.
My guess is the question came from my comment about there's a very clear line of demarcation between the two of us. So they complement each other by helping the customer. I'm going to go back to what Joseph said early on, realize that it is possible to get this monolithic thing off of the floor and into the public cloud. But there are two really different components. There's hardware and finances in bucket number one, and there's technology in bucket number two. ReluTech doesn't do the technology piece. Candid doesn't do the hardware and the finance piece. So we're totally complementary because there's bookends to the journey. And if the customer can't figure out how to separate the hardware issue, the refresh avoidance, the relief of capital debt, they're never going to get to the technology part. And oh, by the way, there's this big thing called the double bubble of cost, where there's a tower of duplicative expenses with the mainframe, with a rising tower of cost with public cloud adoption. And if you can pull the tower of the data center and hardware costs down, the financial piece, and repurpose that to a company like Candid, then maybe you could fund a POC. Heck, maybe you can fund a full migration. And those things are, without question, 100% complementary and not in any way, shape, or form competitive. So that's how I'd answer it. Great question. Aaron, anything?
Exactly what Ted said.
Well, guys, I know we have another 1 or 2 minutes left, so I thought in that time, I wanted to first of all start by thanking the attendees, thanking you guys as our hosts. If anyone would like to reach out to either of you, I think your information is readily available. Will be sent out to folks after this call, but I know that Mainframe right now seems very scary for a lot of organizations. It's scary to keep it, and there's a lot of I think fear around what to do with it. I think you guys have really brought a lot of clarity to it, or at least I can speak for me, really made it seem like there's a definite answer out there, and this can definitely be done, and it can be done successfully and securely. So I was very taken aback by the cost savings numbers. I find that to be really compelling. So I want to thank both of you. I want to invite any of the attendees. Please feel free to reach out to Aaron or Ted. And I want to thank everybody for your attendance today. So with that, I guess I'll let everybody go now, but thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody, for attending. See ya.
All right. See you, everybody.
Bye.